The termination letter trembled in her hands as the hospital director turned away, and the echo of his footsteps down the corridor sounded louder than the monitors screaming behind the ICU doors. In that single moment, with daylight pouring through glass walls that made everything painfully visible, Arwa Haleem felt something inside her fracture, not loudly, but completely, because the place she had given her youth, her nights, her sanity, had just discarded her like a liability. If you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, take a moment right now to support Kind Soul Narratives by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, because some stories begin in loss but rise towards something unforgettable. Arwa walked out into the sunlit rooftop access hallway because she could not breathe indoors anymore. The hospital was alive in its usual daytime chaos, gurneys rolling, staff rushing, sunlight bouncing off white floors, but to her, it felt like a silent movie with no sound. Her mind replayed the director's reasons over and over, all wrapped in sterile language about policy violations and reputational risk. None of it mentioned the real reason. None of it acknowledged the decision she had made 3 weeks earlier to ignore an order and stay with a patient long past her shift, to keep his failing body alive with her own hands until the right help arrived. That help never came in time. The patient died anyway, and somehow the blame settled neatly on her shoulders. She leaned against the railing and stared across the city. Below, traffic moved like nothing in the world had changed. Arwa had grown up in a coastal town where her father repaired fishing boats and her mother taught primary school, a place where people stayed late for each other without paperwork. Her father had died from a delayed diagnosis when she was 17, a mistake buried under forms and apologies. That loss had carved her into someone who stayed too long, who refused to walk away when someone was slipping. It was the reason she became a trauma nurse. It was also, apparently, the reason she was no longer welcome here. Her phone buzzed with unread messages from colleagues who had heard whispers but were too afraid to step in. Arwa did not open them. She remembered every overnight shift where she had held shaking hands, every silent prayer whispered into surgical masks, every time she went home with blood still under her nails and slept anyway because lives needed her in the morning. She remembered the Navy medics she had once trained alongside during a disaster response workshop years ago, how they had treated triage like a sacred duty, how one of them had said that in chaos, the only thing that mattered was who stayed. The hospital director stood in his office several floors below, reviewing schedules and press statements, relieved that the problem had been removed. He believed order was maintained by rules, that discipline was what kept institutions alive. He did not see Arwa's shaking shoulders on the rooftop, or the way she pressed her palm against her chest, as if checking whether her heart was still willing to work for a world that had just rejected it. Then the wind changed. At first it was only a low vibration, barely noticeable, like distant thunder. Arwa frowned and looked up as the sound grew heavier, slicing through the afternoon air. Staff began stepping out onto balconies and walkways, shielding their eyes from the sun. The vibration became a roar, powerful enough to rattle windows, powerful enough to pull Arwa out of her grief and anchor her back into the present. A Navy helicopter emerged from the horizon, dark against the sky, moving with purpose directly toward the hospital. Time seemed to stretch as the aircraft descended. The rooftop landing zone, rarely used, suddenly came alive with flashing indicators and rushing personnel. Arwa watched, confused, as security scrambled and administrators hurried upstairs, their faces tight with disbelief. The helicopter hovered, whined whipping coats and hair, and then settled onto the roof with the authority of something that did not ask permission to exist. From the open door stepped a uniformed Navy officer whose presence commanded silence without effort. His posture carried the weight of command and exhaustion, of nights spent making decisions that could not be undone. Behind him followed medics carrying sealed cases and a stretcher prepared for movement, their movements precise and urgent. The officer's gaze cut across the rooftop and landed on Arwa, still in her scrubs, still clutching the envelope that had ended her career minutes earlier. As he approached, Arwa felt an old instinct rise, the one that had guided her through every crisis. She straightened, wiping her face with the back of her hand, unsure why she was suddenly the center of attention. She noticed the hospital director rushing toward them, his expression shifting rapidly from authority to confusion to something dangerously close to fear. The Navy officer did not slow. He handed over a sealed document to the director, whose hands now trembled far more visibly than Arwa's had. The contents were not announced, but the color drained from the director's face as he read. The officer's eyes never left Arwa. Recognition passed through them, followed by something deeper, respect mixed with relief. Arwa's mind raced as memories surfaced. The patient she had stayed with, the emergency call placed too late, the experimental stabilization technique she had used, learned during that long-ago disaster workshop with Navy medics. It had not saved him, but it had kept his organs viable long enough for something else. Something no one in hospital administration had bothered to investigate. The officer gestured, and one of the medics opened a case, revealing documents stamped with military insignia. The director's rigid posture collapsed inward as understanding finally arrived. The patient Arwa had refused to abandon had been a classified operative, carrying information critical to lives far beyond these walls. The hours Arwa had bought with her defiance had allowed a remote extraction of data, preventing an operation that would have cost dozens of sailors their lives. The Navy had traced the chain back to her. Arwa felt the weight of the moment settle slowly, not as triumph but as quiet validation. All the nights she questioned herself. All the mornings she wondered if compassion was a weakness in a system that prized efficiency. The helicopter blade slowed above them, sunlight glinting off steel, and she realized that her choice, the one that had destroyed her career minutes ago, had mattered more than she would ever fully understand. Around them, the hospital staff stood frozen, watching their reality rearrange itself. The director tried to speak, to regain control of the narrative, but there was no space left for his voice. Authority had shifted, not loudly but completely. The officer extended a hand toward Arwa, not as a demand but as an acknowledgement. In his presence, she felt seen in a way the hospital had never truly managed. She felt her father's memory settle beside her, not as pain, but as something proud and warm. She felt the years of exhaustion lift just enough for her to breathe again. As the Navy medics prepared to depart, the officer made it clear that the termination was void, that external review would follow, and that Arwa's actions were not only justified but honored. The words rippled outward, changing how everyone saw her, but Arwa understood that the real change was internal. She had been tested, stripped, and left raw, and still she had stayed true to the reason she entered this field in the first place. Before the helicopter lifted off again, Arwa stood alone at the edge of the roof, the city stretched wide before her. She was still tired, she was still wounded, but she was no longer broken. She knew now that doing the right thing did not always look heroic in the moment, and that institutions could fail even when individuals did not. If this story has touched your heart so far, take a moment to support it by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Kind Soul Narratives, because stories like this survive through the people who believe in them. Please comment below what this moment meant to you before the final scene unfolds. The helicopter rose into the sky, its sound fading into the afternoon, and Arwa remained standing in the sunlight, no longer defined by a letter or a title. She was defined by the choice she made when no one was watching, by the life she honored even when it cost her everything. And as the hospital resumed its rhythm behind her, she stepped forward into a future reshaped by courage, carrying the quiet knowledge that sometimes, when the world fires you for caring too much, the universe answers by reminding you exactly who you are.